Close your eyes and imagine a world where the seasons simply stopped. It is July 1816. In the green hills of Vermont, a farmer named Thomas wakes up, expects the sweltering heat of the New England sun, and instead opens his door to a nightmare. A foot of snow buries his front porch. The birds that should be singing are found frozen in the fields, their tiny bodies stiff on the ice-crusted soil. His corn, the only thing keeping his 5 children from starvation, is a blackened, shriveled mess of rot. He looks up at the sky, but the sun he's known his whole life is gone. In its place is a pale, ghostly disk shimmering behind a thick, reddish-purple haze that never goes away. He doesn't know it yet, but he is living through the apocalypse. This is the true story of the most terrifying climate disaster in human history, a year known as 1800 and froze to death. It was a year of blood-red snow, global famine, and a darkness so profound it drove men to madness and gave birth to the greatest monsters in literature. The terror didn't start in America. It started on the other side of the planet, in the Dutch East Indies, on an island called Sumbawa. There stood Mount Tambora, a sleeping giant that no one expected to wake. But in April 1815, Tambora didn't just erupt, it detonated with the force of 1,000 Hiroshima bombs. The explosion was so violent that it literally blew the top 4,000 feet off the mountain, sending a plume of ash and sulfur reaching 28 miles into the stratosphere. The sound was a roar so deafening it was heard 1,600 miles away. Local governors thought it was a naval invasion and scrambled their troops, but the enemy wasn't a fleet of ships, it was the sky itself. 150 cubic kilometers of volcanic debris were pumped into the atmosphere, catching the high-altitude winds and wrapping around the Earth like a suffocating chemical blanket. As this veil of ash drifted toward the United States, the American pioneers were blissfully unaware that a geological time bomb was about to shatter their world. By the spring of 1816, the dry fog arrived in the Northeast. Scientists of the time were baffled. This wasn't a normal mist. It was a persistent, sun-blocking haze that wouldn't wash away even in the heaviest rains. People in Boston and New York looked up at a sun that appeared like a dim copper coin. You could stare at it for hours without hurting your eyes. But the beauty of the sky was a mask for a brutal reality. The heat was being reflected back into space. The Earth was cooling at a terrifying rate. In May, the frost came, not a light dusting, but a killing freeze that turned the vibrant spring green into a graveyard of black stalks. On June 6th, the unthinkable happened. A massive blizzard tore through New England. In some places, the snowdrifts were 20 inches deep. Men were found wandering in the woods, frozen to death in their light summer waistcoats. Mothers were forced to burn their family's wooden furniture just to keep their children warm in the middle of June. The psychological toll on the American public was catastrophic. Without the internet, without the telegraph, people had no explanation. There was a genuine, widespread belief that the end of the world had arrived. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some blamed Benjamin Franklin's new lightning rods, claiming they were sucking the heat out of the atmosphere. Others believed the sun was simply burning out. In the absence of facts, superstition took over. Prayer meetings were held in every town square as people begged for the return of the sun, but the sky remained a bruised, unnatural purple. As the summer progressed, the Great Famine set in. This wasn't just a bad harvest, it was a total collapse of the agricultural economy. The price of grain skyrocketed. Corn that once cost 12 cents a bushel was now selling for $2, an impossible sum for a struggling family. This economic desperation triggered one of the most significant migrations in American history. Thousands of families abandoned their ancestral homes in New England, packing their meager lives into wagons and heading west. They were searching for the promised land of the Ohio River Valley, hoping the frost hadn't reached the interior. Among those fleeing the ice was a young boy named Joseph Smith. His family's crops in Vermont had failed 3 years in a row, leaving them in crushing debt. They moved to New York, and it was in this atmosphere of gloom, starvation, and religious hysteria that the foundations of the Mormon Church were laid. The volcano hadn't just changed the weather, it was rewriting the religious and geographical map of the United States. But while the American farmers were fighting for bread, a different kind of drama was unfolding across the Atlantic. On the shores of Lake Geneva in Switzerland, a group of young, rebellious aristocrats had gathered for a summer of decadence. Among them were Lord Byron, the most scandalous poet of the age, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and a 19-year-old girl named Mary Godwin. They had rented a grand villa, expecting a Mediterranean paradise of boating and sunshine. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a literal house of horrors. The rain was relentless and freezing. The sky was so dark they had to keep candles burning at noon. Outside their windows, the local peasants were rioting for food, and the lake looked like a gray, churning abyss. To pass the time and combat the deep depression caused by the lack of sunlight, Lord Byron proposed a game he called nightmares, and Mary Shelley started to see them during the day. She imagined a pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside a creature she'd stitched together from the dead. This was the moment Frankenstein was born. At the same time, Byron's doctor, John Polidori, took a fragment of an idea and created the vampire, the very first story to portray the vampire as a sophisticated, aristocratic predator. If that volcano in Indonesia hadn't erupted, Mary Shelley would have been outside in the sun. She never would have been trapped in that dark room. Our entire modern culture of horror, from Dracula to every sci-fi monster we know, was quite literally born from the ash of a volcanic winter. As 1816 bled into autumn, the hungry time became a global nightmare. In Europe, the situation was even dire than in America. The Napoleonic Wars had just ended, leaving the continent broke and exhausted. Now, with the crops dead, typhus began to sweep through the starving populations. It was the greatest medical crisis of the 19th century. In Switzerland, people were so hungry they resorted to baking bread out of sawdust and moss. In Ireland, the potato crop failed for the first time, a dark omen of the famine that would strike decades later. But even in this darkness, human ingenuity began to spark. Because there were no oats to feed horses, the animals were dying by the thousands. People needed a way to travel without animal power. A German inventor named Karl Dreiss took this as a challenge and created the Lauf machine, or running machine. It was a wooden frame with 2 wheels that the rider pushed with their feet. We know it today as the bicycle. The death of the horse led to the birth of modern transportation. The winter of 1816 to 1817 was the final brutal blow. In some parts of the United States, temperatures dropped so low that the mercury in thermometers actually froze solid. But as the spring of 1817 finally dawned, something changed. The ash in the stratosphere, which had been circling the globe for 2 years, finally began to settle. The dry fog lifted. For the first time in over a year, the sun felt warm on the skin of the survivors. The world they emerged into, however, was fundamentally different. New England was no longer the undisputed center of American life. The power had shifted toward the West. The Industrial Revolution had been accelerated because people realized that biological systems, crops and horses could fail, but machines could endure. The year without a summer remains a haunting reminder of how thin the line is between civilization and chaos. It shows us that a single geological event on a remote island can starve a family in Vermont, spark a new religion, and inspire the greatest horror stories ever told. We are in many ways the children of the ash. Our maps, our inventions, and our monsters all trace their roots back to that year the sun died. It is a story of survival, of how humanity, when faced with an endless winter, found a way to keep the fire burning and turn the darkness into art. As we face our own climate uncertainties today, 1816 stands as a warning from the past. We live at the mercy of a restless planet, and sometimes the seasons don't come back.